Meaningless. Everything is utterly meaningless. My name is, well, it matters not. I am called Kohelet in my native Hebrew, difficult to translate into English, but teacher of the assembly, or just the teacher, will do. In Greek, Ecclesiastes. I am known as the writer of the book by that name found in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament of the Bible. Now, some say the actual author of my book was King Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived. I find that flattering. Others believe that my book had several authors, 4 or 5 perhaps. I occasionally have difficulty making up my mind, but not because I have several of them. Now, some readers refer to my writings as the most troublesome book in the Bible and say that it should never have been included in the sacred canon in the first place. Of course, I disagree. But I will surmise that you have rarely heard my book preached about in this church, and perhaps others. I do admit that my writings speak in a tone of voice almost unique in the Bible, which, as you may know, is mostly impassioned preaching, poems, songs, inspirational stories. But to some readers, I sound bitter, even angry, cynical. Others call me fatalistic, a man resigned to things that frighten him as he approaches the end of his lifespan. Some, I am happy to say, consider my writings courageous. They praise me for being brutally honest about the realities of human existence, for relentlessly exploring its boundaries. Of course, I find myself in agreement with such wise people. So, what is my book, the book of Ecclesiastes, really about? My critics call it a rambling, repetitive lecture on the purported meaning of life. They say it has no plot, no clear structure, and that many of my statements often contradict each other. They say that my writings are plagued by pessimistic assertions that some readers who are comfortably settled into their religion find threatening or even offensive. Well, these people, I presume, are referring to such assertions on my part that, working hard for gain is meaningless. We lose it all at death. Or that our deeds in life, good and evil, are meaningless because, in the end, all of us, rich or poor, righteous and wicked, foolish and wise, we all go to the same grave. And some believers, both my fellow Jews and Gentiles, take issue with my view that even though God is completely sovereign over our lives, our human minds and experience are so limited that we cannot possibly discern the will and purpose of God, much less govern ourselves by it. So, am I the teacher, an embittered cynic, or a courageous realist? Well, perhaps all such labels are superficial. Perhaps there's more to my writings that a simple reading might reveal, but I will let you be the judge of that after you hear my story. And if you will promise to keep an open mind, I promise in turn to share with you my innermost thoughts and feelings, because my writings may indeed be considered the most personal of reflections found in the entire Bible. So as I grew older and faced the inevitable specter of death, I found myself desperately wondering if my life had any real meaning. And if not, what could I do to make my life matter before it was too late? Perhaps some of you have occasionally wondered the same. For indeed I have seen there is nothing new under the sun. I felt empty. I felt aching. I felt a need to know that my existence meant more than just a short stay on this earth before I just disappear. So I set out to test some of the well-worn pathways by which many have sought meaning in their lives: pleasure, wealth, wisdom, and piety. Now, this life experiment, I regret to say, failed to achieve its desired results. But I learned some startling lessons from that experience that I felt compelled to record for all the generations that I will share with you now. First, while I was still relatively young, I focused on magnifying my own personal pleasure. The specific pursuits for doing so I chose not to reveal in my book, although I do acknowledge trying to find cheer in much wine in the company of women. As I said, there is nothing new under the sun. And I embraced folly in a number of other ways that I shall not here name, living in reckless abandon in a way that made some men I knew jealous of me. But I was amazed to find that merriment for its own sake is madness, that worldly pleasure is of no use at all. When you constantly seek to whet your appetite with the pleasures of the flesh, your hunger can never be satisfied, and you can never fully enjoy those pleasures, which may be taken away from you by misfortune in the blink of an eye in any event. Simply put, I saw that pure pleasure, while it may serve as, well, the dessert in life, can never be the main course. I saw that focusing on nothing more than satisfying my own appetite for earthly pleasure was meaningless. And so next, I set out to acquire great material wealth by building many successful businesses in construction and agriculture, precious metals, and other lucrative endeavors. I became one of the wealthiest, and thus, of course, well-regarded men in Jerusalem. Eventually, however, while lounging about in my luxurious estate surrounded by my servants, I found myself perplexed, wondering why did my life still seem empty of true meaning when I had achieved such material success. Perhaps some of you have had similar musings. I can testify that pursuing riches for their own sake is like, well, it's like chasing the wind. The more I accumulated, the more I consumed, and thus the more needs I felt. The more possessions one has, the more one has to lose when the time of trial comes, as it always does. So I say this: the hoarding of wealth is futile. None of it goes to you in death, and that which you leave behind may, despite your best efforts, go to someone you don't even like, who may use it for purposes you would not approve. Great riches and wealth, meaningless. After learning that painful lesson, I was seized by an obsession to study and understand worldly wisdom, to distinguish it from human madness and folly. But I found that such understanding, if one can even obtain it, has significant human limits. I have seen under the sun that wisdom is indeed better than wealth. For one thing, the wise know when to hold their tongues, while fools, rich or not, talk too much and often say too little. Wisdom has other merits. It teaches us that life has its limits, that a sure and certain ending awaits all of us. It is true the wise see many things that fools who walk in darkness do not, but the same fate awaits them all. In fact, all of us. We come from dust, we all return to dust. I have seen that in much wisdom lies much aggravation. The more knowledge we acquire, the more pain we suffer, because the better we comprehend the injustice, the unfairness, the tragedy in this world. And so even though I had accumulated much wisdom, I did not come to love my life because I better understood life's imperfections. And my worldly wisdom all seemed meaningless. Finally, as do many persons in old age, I turned to religion, looking for meaning in living a pious life, finding time for pursuits of the Spirit, for which I had been too busy or too sophisticated before. I looked directly to God for my personal security and serenity. But this pathway also failed me. Even though I practiced the highest levels of piety, it could not protect me from death or even my fear of death. No amount of righteous living would allow me to bargain with God, saying, "Look how admirable my life is, God. Isn't it in your best interest that I go on living forever rather than die and disappear?" The pleasure, wealth, wisdom, piety, for me, they all proved utterly meaningless. So my life experiment did not reveal the great answer to the insistent question, what is the real pathway to immortal meaning in our lives? But my search did impart some valuable lessons. For one, I have seen that God is fully sovereign over our lives, that the world has its own stubborn shape according to God's will and wisdom, which we cannot reshape to our liking, and that our finite human minds can never fully fathom that infinite wisdom. And I learned that God's world has its own relentless rhythms that we find ourselves unavoidably caught up in perpetual seasons of life, both of joy and of sorrow, a time to every purpose under heaven. It's as if life is set to its own music. And music is timeless. It speaks to us across the centuries. I'm gratified that a portion of my book has been set to music. Listen now. Being teacher of the assembly, I would be remiss if I did not leave you with some counsel. For despite the false starts and disappointments in my life experiment, I eventually came to peace with our lot in life, because I believe that is what God, in His inscrutable and sovereign will, has given us to do. And so I say this to all generations and to you. Do not obsessively search for the great answer, the immortal deed that will give our lives immortal meaning. Instead, focus on filling each day with individual moments that you find gratifying. Seek not simple pleasure for its own sake. Instead, take genuine satisfaction in the simple things that come to you daily through the seasons of life, the music of the moment. Savor those moments that by their very nature cannot last forever. The shifting colors revealed in the glow of a sunset, your first bite into a ripe and luscious fruit, the warmth of a human embrace, a baby's first cry. Such moments in our lives can seem eternal without actually being everlasting. How spectacular could a sunset be if it didn't gradually fade into the darkness? So I say this: eat your bread joyfully. Drink your wine happily, because that is acceptable to God. Take satisfaction in performing well whatever work you choose to do. Enjoy what is given to you as well as you can, whenever you can. Good food, adequate accommodations, entertainment of the mind, even clean clothes. And try not to do any of this alone. Whenever possible, be in genuine companionship with those you love and who love you, for they are indeed gifts from God. How unhappy are those who fall and do not have a companion to help them rise. Also, I say this, when times are good, enjoy them. And when they are bad, remember that God made such times too. The challenges of life remind us that we cannot fathom the future, much less control it. We can only do our best to understand and cope with what is happening now. The disappointments of life remind us that the race does not always go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor favors to the skilled. For time and chance happen to them all. And I say this, cast your bread upon the waters. And by this I mean share such bounty as you've been given with those in greater need. You never know how such bread may be returned to you. Finally, remember that the fear of God is the beginning of true wisdom, that which keeps us from folly and guides our life. And by fear, I do not mean the negative emotion that someone or something may harm you. I mean the positive feelings of awe and inspiration, the infinite wisdom and power of God compared to our finite humanity call for our utmost respect and reverence. But I also say this, our worship of God should never be silly or insincere. Watch your steps when you go into God's house. Do not speak hastily before God, and do not make any promises to God that you cannot keep. For God takes no pleasure in fools. Well, my children, there is no way for us to avoid death, but the cure to the fear of death is to make sure that we have gratefully lived in the music of each moment, day by day, the best we can. For when we have learned to live the best we can, life itself is the reward. It's a gift from God. Meaningless. Meaningless, everything is utterly meaningless. Or is it?